Russian, and Japanese. You can select your preferred language using the interpretation icon or using those three small dots icon and selecting interpretation in your language. We will begin shortly, waiting for a few more attendees to join from the waiting room. Again, welcome to everyone. This is the ITUC Global Webinar for Democracy that delivers peace and prosperity for all. We have simultaneous interpretation in English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, and Japanese. You can select your preferred language using the interpretation icon in your Zoom account, and we will begin in just a minute. Okay, and one more time, welcome everyone. This is the ITUC Global Webinar for Democracy that delivers peace and prosperity for all. For those of you just logging in and joining us, we have simultaneous interpretation in English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, and Japanese. Make sure you select your preferred language in the interpretation icon. And we'll begin now with opening remarks from ITUC General Secretary Luc Triangle, who is joining us remotely from South Africa. Luc, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Todd, and welcome to all of you, sisters, brothers, friends, colleagues. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you today. And indeed, as Todd says, I'm calling in from South Africa, where we are meeting today and tomorrow with our Labour 20 trade unions, our so-called L20, and where we will meet later this week the employment ministers of the G20 countries. And you know, we are talking here about social justice, and in the foundation of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, social justice is connected hand in hand with peace. So actually what we are doing here is strongly connected with the subject also of our webinar. Today we are here united across movements, across borders and across struggles, trade union movement, environmental movements, economic justice movement, and the peace movement. We are united to say that peace is it's not some far away an abstract fantasy. It is an urgent demand and a material necessity for those for us living and working every day in the real world. In fact, it is war that is unrealistic. It is war that is absurd. It is those who make decisions about war from the safety of their ministries and compounds who are living in a fantasy land. Whether in the Middle East or Ukraine, Myanmar or Sudan, it is working people who are paying the highest price for war. It is our lives that are lost. It is our families who are shattered. It is our livelihoods and communities and ecosystems which are destroyed. It is trade unions and social movements like those gathered on this call today who have been demanding that our governments face this reality. Unfortunately, the number of governments and political forces who promote the ridiculous idea that war will solve our problems is in these days increasing. We face an important crossroads now for the entire world, the biggest since the Second World War. In 1 week time, Monday, I will arrive in Japan to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the appalling atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world we face today is even more dangerous than the one we faced then. Military spending has reached obscene levels. Trillions of dollars are diverted from schools, hospitals, decent work, and climate action. Nuclear armed states are increasingly unstable and reckless with their threats. A billionaire coup is sweeping the globe, financing far-right political parties and threatening democracy at work, in society, and in global institutions. Authoritarianism is on the march on every continent. But we are here today to say there is an alternative. Workers want a new social contract built on solidarity, not domination, built on cooperation, not confrontation, built on democracy and not on autocracy, on common security and not on endless war. In Japan, I will be joining Rengo, the Japanese Trade Union Confederation, which has worked tirelessly in the service of peace and disarmament, as well as major trade union leaders from around the world. And we will there renew our call for a common security agenda centered around cooperation among nations and solidarity between peoples. Because we recognize that true security lies first and foremost in meeting the basic needs of all people. And this agenda includes those key elements we are united around in our joint statement today. Universal ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Secondly, the adoption of progressive tax policies, implementation of living wages and universal social protection, because we cannot build a stable world unless we address these growing inequalities. Thirdly, redirecting military expenditures toward the urgent need of human development, climate action and global health in a way that creates good union jobs that produce what our societies really need. And fourth, integrating disarmament and sustainability into climate action plans, because militarism is one of the major contributors to the climate crisis. The International Trade Union Confederation will raise these and other trade union demands not just in Japan, but also in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, in Doha in November for the World Social Summit, in Johannesburg to the G20, and in Brazil also for the COP30. We will call on our governments to learn from, not repeat, the past and build a better world where the threat of nuclear weapons is eradicated, where democracy delivers peace and prosperity for all people, and where common security is guaranteed through solidarity and sustainable development. As trade unions, we stand proudly in this grand coalition for peace. We are especially grateful to Greenpeace, to the International Peace Bureau, to ICANN, to 350 and Oxfam for anchoring this joint statement today, and to all of the organizations that have signed on. I thank you very much. Unfortunately, I will not be able to stay the whole time in this webinar because I have to go back to my Labor 20 meeting, but I'm sure that we can build on this webinar and continue our fight together for this better world and for this peaceful world. Thank you very much, and back to you, Todd.
Thank you very much, Luke. And as Luke has said, he has to leave us now to return to exactly one of those meetings he mentioned, which is the L20 and G20 in Johannesburg. So for everyone on the call, my name is Todd Brogan. I'm the Director of Campaigns and Organizing for the ITUC, based here in Brussels. And before I introduce our panelists, I also want to make sure that everyone watching has a copy of the statement we've just released today. So this will be dropped in the chat by my colleagues in the communications department, and you'll see the full statement and all of the signatory organizations, which is a list, fortunately, too long to name on one call. Thank you very much, Diana. That's now in the chat. I also want to add a little bit of context to our discussion today. As we've seen what is unfolding, whether in Gaza or Kiev, in Kashmir or Khartoum, we recognize that these crises have their own unique origins and motives and abject horrors, but they are bound together by a common root causes that are global in nature and, as Luke laid out, deteriorating rapidly. That's a concentration of wealth and power into the hands of a very few. It's the collaboration of those few with an anti-democratic, rising far-right political force. And it's the shared belief that they have that security can only be assured through authoritarianism, militarism, and war. And also, as Luke mentioned, we've been here before, unfortunately, just 80 years ago, and it ended in nuclear war. And so as we approach the 80th anniversary, we know the survivors, many of whom were just honored with the Nobel Peace Prize last year, are dwindling in number, but they're still among us, and they're watching as governments make countless new victims of countless new crimes. Just now, the ITUC has released a statement which my colleagues have also now put in the chat on the arrests of trade unionists on the flotilla bound for Gaza. So we'll direct you to this as well. But that's why today we're bringing together partners from the peace, the environmental, the economic justice, and wider movements to discuss these root causes of these crises. What do they share, and what can be done? What's some of the policy that we can implement, that governments can implement at these meetings Luke mentioned, to make the popular alternative a reality? So we're going to hear from each of them, and then we'll open up to comments and questions from all of you. You can enter those in the chat or in the Q&A button that you see on Zoom, and we'll have plenty of time for these at the end. So joining us today are Sean Connor. Sean is the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau. He's an expert on intercultural conflict management. He's lived and worked in the US and Nicaragua, and now is based in Berlin, Germany. Susanna Compton. Susie is Greenpeace International's program lead on deterring the escalating use of intimidation to suppress activism and dissent. Ed Pomfret. Ed is the Deputy Director for Advocacy, Campaigns, and Engagement at Oxfam International. Agnes Hall. Agnes serves as the Global Campaigns Director at 350.org. And Daniel Hoekstra. Daniel is the Deputy Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. He's been with ICAN since 2012 and helped coordinate advocacy in the lead up to and during the negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So we've got a great panel of people representing organizations that take lead roles in all of these different movements. So now I'm going to turn to our panelists. Welcome to all of you. Sean, I want to start with you and the International Peace Bureau, because much of what we talk about in the statement, that again, for the audience, is in the chat and in a link that you can read, but much of what we talk about is common security, which the International Peace Bureau, Nobel Prize winning organization, has championed for years. Can you tell us a bit about, in the audience, a bit about what common security is and why it's such an important framework for changing the narrative around war and peace and the conflicts we're seeing right now? Sean?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Todd, for the introduction. The basic idea behind common security is that the security of one is inextricably linked with the security of all, or that the security of a state, nation, or people cannot be achieved at the expense of the security of another. The term was originally coined during the 1980s Cold War tensions between the Eastern and Western blocs. Both conventional and nuclear arms races were underway, including the stationing of intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe. The presence of these weapons in particular did not make Europe safer, but rather, I think many Europeans living through the time will remember there was a high level of insecurity in Europe in these moments. It made it much more likely that these weapons would be used, whether purposeful or accidental, and there was pressure felt on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Likewise, there was a conventional arms race that was underway. Both sides hoped to achieve a military superiority over their adversary and therefore achieve some perceived security. But in reality, it fueled further arms races, further arms spending by their adversaries, and increased deadly capacities of both sides, resulting in a net loss of security. At the time, the arms race deprived Europeans of money so badly needed also for the social well-being. The Palme Commission that had gathered in 1982 recognized this trend in the Cold War and argued that security is not a zero-sum game, that security can be built through trust building, through cooperation and disarmament. The 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, was one practical example of this in progress that effectively banned an entire class of missiles, nuclear-capable missiles, and increased the security of both the Eastern and Western blocs during the Cold War. Of course, we know the 21st century, we're facing many different challenges, a different geopolitical reality than the 20th century Cold War competition. The importance of common security has also seemingly been completely forgotten by political leaders, global leaders, who are increasingly pursuing their own geopolitical interests and economic interests to the detriment of the security of all. And I think Luke did a wonderful job of outlining, so I may repeat a few points, but I'll try to avoid too much repetition here. Really, the selfish pursuance of these interests under the guise of national security has led to an increase in wars and violent conflicts. It's fueled a polycrisis that we're seeing today with vast economic and social inequalities in and between our societies, and the breakdown of climate and environment, and of course, an erosion of true democratic governance. We're seeing also how the issues that we're facing at the moment cannot be tackled by any one nation alone. Whether we look at climate change and environmental degradation, we know quite clearly this cannot be contained within the borders of any one country or kept out of the borders of any one country. To address these issues, global cooperation is the only solution that we have. And then when we look at the geopolitical situation that we have at the moment, we see no longer two large military blocs or alliances in competition. Instead, we see a largely hegemonic West led by the NATO bloc, which comprises over half of all global military spending. However, at the same time, there's a shift that's underway away from the post-Cold War order towards a multipolar order in which military power, economic force, and influence are challenged by other regional powers around the world. And the result of this is that there's an increased reliance on military means to benefit from these shifts. We find ourselves in a new arms race, drastic increases in military spending, as Luke had mentioned. We're also seeing an erosion of disarmament treaties, particularly nuclear disarmament treaties, bilateral or otherwise. And the military spending continues to rise year after year, with plans for further rises already underway for the next decade and beyond. And at the same time, we're seeing also an erosion or ignorance of diplomatic and peaceful conflict resolution tools, particularly international institutions like the United Nations, International Criminal Court, and the ICJ, International Court of Justice. Nowhere is this clearer than, of course, what we're seeing in Gaza at the moment, where the ongoing genocide of Palestinians continues despite the global efforts for a ceasefire and an end to the occupation. There is an impunity in international law and no accountability for the injustices and war crimes that the Israeli military is currently committing. Of course, this is not just limited to West Asia, and Todd, as you had mentioned, also from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the civil war in Sudan, the M23 occupation of the eastern DRC, and growing military tensions in the South China, West Philippine Sea, Korean Peninsula, so on and so forth. This faulty logic of militarism and deterrence are reigning supreme and bringing us closer to the brink. Common security also is a way to understand these interconnections between the issues that we're facing, whether it be the effect that rising military spending and militarism has on the environment, or the inequalities within and beyond our societies. So in this context, common security provides us with an alternative to the status quo of militarization, warfare, and climate collapse, and the growing inequalities, opting instead for the understanding that we are all in this together, that we share in our security, and that the way to resolve our problem comes through dialogue, diplomacy, and disarmament efforts. And from this understanding, we can build these tools to create trust between governments and peoples and form a basis for further cooperation and peaceful coexistence, resolution of disputes, and so on. We need to address the root causes of the conflicts and instability rather than exacerbating them. To make common security an effective alternative, however, the concept must also have traction both among global civil society and among our leadership. Pressure from below can pressure our leaders to take a different approach, to recognize that the path we're on is threatening all of us and what makes us truly feel secure. We base common security in human security, the freedom from fear and want for people around the world. Good quality jobs, social safety nets, a healthy environment, and peaceful conflict resolution are essential parts of this idea of human security. Moving towards concrete suggestions, firstly, we need to establish dialogue between governments as a basis for relations rather than threats or of physical or economic violence. Secondly, we need to renew disarmament architectures, including the universal ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but also treaties that are restricting or completely banning new weapons technologies such as artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems, weaponized drones, the weaponization of outer space and hypersonic missiles, and we need robust verifications mechanisms for these systems to also build that trust. We need mutual reductions in conventional arms that can lead to a net gain in the security of all peoples, and diplomatic thinking that doesn't view every negotiation as a zero-sum game, but rather actions that can increase the security of all. Furthermore, we need to strengthen international institutions and the role of international law and foster people-to-people exchanges and cultural exchanges. Of course, common security itself will not resolve the problems, all of the problems that we face, but it is an essential shift in our thinking that can facilitate the next steps and avoid the worst consequences of continuing down the path we're on. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Sean. I want to come back to you specifically on the point of the arms race and the corresponding deprivation from other social programs and other investments. But you also mentioned the interconnectedness that common security identifies between environmental degradation, the need for people to be free from fear of want. And I think it's a good segue to talk to Greenpeace International, to Susie, because we all know Greenpeace International. It's known the world over for taking direct action to confront the climate crisis. But increasingly, we see a reaction from militarists, from those that favor a military solution to our problems at home in the domestic front, where there's that direct action is being suppressed by governments. And for those of us that come from other movements, some people may want to look the other way and say, oh, this is happening to environmental activists. But the fact is that for trade unions, especially at the international level, these basic fundamental freedoms, like the freedom to assemble, the freedom to associate, the freedom to speak, are core parts of what makes democracy valuable to a worker, what makes it worth fighting for democracy. And to see this suppressed in this moment is incredibly troubling. So, Susie, what do you think is behind this suppression, and how are you at Greenpeace and the climate movement more broadly adapting in this moment?
Thank you very much, Todd. It's an honor to be here in this company, and my pleasure to speak on behalf of the Greenpeace Network today. Like you were saying, more than 50 years of history, victory, controversy, famous for saving whales, palm oil moratoriums, challenging nuclear testing, getting bombed, hanging off bridges. Not that famous for being as social as we are environmental, I think it is fair to say. But 2025 feels very different. And this year we also look different. Alongside a big coalition of our allies and our supporters are calling for a Make Polluters Pay pact to get the fossil fuel industry to stop drilling and start paying for the adaptation, mitigation, transition needs all around us. Alongside many others, also, our supporters are calling out obscene inequality, demanding a wealth tax to liberate public spending on urgently needed social environmental programs. Just on Friday, Greenpeace UK activists blocked a fracked gas shipment for 24 hours. Not just because the gas would become another unnecessary 60 million plastic bottles, but really because its billionaire owner is using his influence to scuttle a new global plastics treaty. And now, as you were mentioning, Todd, as some of our entities face one of the most egregious lawsuits, and I'll come back to this, ever to be brought against a movement whose only demand is a livable future for all, we are very much committed to resist and to offer ways into acts of resistance, courage, and hope. And in this way, we are really trying to speak beyond our usual audiences, to all of those people who are looking around in 2025 and thinking, what on earth is going on? And the easiest thing to feel today is hopeless. And that's exactly what those behind or supporting the rollback in protest laws, the unfounded legal attacks on individuals, journalists, organizations, and movements want us to feel. They want us to feel hopeless. We call it corporate intimidation. It could also be described as corporate emboldenment or an enabling environment, as some of you were discussing, where governments were faced with tariff wars, public spending pressure, social unrest. They're really closing ranks, and they're betting on the kind of power that they know and they understand. And although the picture changes a little bit around the world, it does feel consistent across the 54 countries in the Greenpeace network that 2025 is really a turning point in social power building. Will we together hold core beliefs and build the scale and the power of the audiences who agree with us, the big us, or faced with all of these innumerable crises, will progressives fracture? I was asked to come and talk about how Greenpeace and the climate movement are adapting to a world where direct action by activists of all kinds, including environmental, is being suppressed by governments and what we think is behind this. And many groups in many countries are grappling with crackdowns. But you may have seen Greenpeace in the news recently for one particularly egregious example, which is that in March, Greenpeace International and Greenpeace in the USA were found liable for over 660 million US dollars, which is a lot of money in anyone's books, related to the powerful indigenous-led Standing Rock protests after a lawsuit that was brought by a fossil fuel pipeline giant, Energy Transfer, whose chairman happens to be a billionaire Trump donor. There are many absurdities there, but one thing is really clear to us, that bullying lawsuits like this and all attempts at rollback or crackdown are not primarily designed to be followed to the letter. They're designed to chill. They're designed to make us worry. They're designed to make us have more discussions before we go public. They're designed to soften our language, to choose the simpler action over the more disruptive one. And though they usually target one group at a time, they're intended to have a chilling effect on the entire movement. Environmental, of course, but also human rights, social, labor, peace. And for us, and we believe for all of us, the best reply to this corporate intimidation is to rise. Not just to be resilient, which is in itself hard enough when you face this kind of attack, but to aim for the resurgence of all of our movements. Stronger, more distributed, more disciplined, ideally more irreverent, also less serious sometimes. And crucially, we think the best reply is to be more in alliance. Together, we are a lot stronger. It's much easier to pick off one group, one angle, one key message than it is to challenge us all. And we are very happy to sign the For Democracy to Deliver statement today, not just because we like putting our signature on things, but because of what we hope that it means, that across different types of social movements, that we're genuinely prepared to pool our power and to offer a meaningful alternative vision to people who, polls show all around the world, are increasingly pessimistic about the future. I assume we all know the famous line, environmentalism without class struggle is gardening. We agree, of course. I live in France, where the end of the world and the end of the month are very intertwined in the public consciousness. But even if the environmental movement somehow thought that we could get away with gardening, any cold-eyed strategy analysis tells us that that's nonsense. The expansion of extractivism is driven by geopolitics as much as by the market. And the simplicity of right-wing narratives is turning back the clock on much of the progress on the social agreements, policy agreements, of course, but also the social agreements, the social contract that we made progress on together through the first 2 decades of this century. But people will support action. We also see that in the polls, no matter how structural and revolutionary our papers say it might be, that if that action addresses their most pressing needs. And that is our challenge and our responsibilities together, to highlight the real solutions and the funds to finance them, because both really are available. So we agree completely that collective security can only be ensured by meeting the basic needs of all people, and we are very proud to have said that together with all of you today. We hope we can go on to test how we talk about this with all kinds of audiences, from our closest supporters to those who are undecided, to even those who might vote in ways that we deeply disagree with. We are surrounded by opportunities as well as threats, and this is certainly how we have chosen to see the lawsuits that are facing us. And seizing those opportunities really requires collectivity, it requires discipline, and for me at least, it requires a certain sense of freedom in how low our societies have sunk, and therefore how far and fast we could rise. Thank you. It's an honor for Greenpeace to be here, and I'm really looking forward to more of this conversation.
Wow. Thank you, Susie. Yeah, when we for a long time had been talking about the suppression of environmental activists from the US and Europe, and especially, but elsewhere as well, and even within our own ranks, what does that mean for trade unionists who are right now fighting in the International Court of Justice to defend the right to strike? What does that mean for anti-war activists, where we've seen also this kind of suppression? I'm American by birth, and you've seen, of course, with university students and almost all of whom are union members, the types of suppression that has happened there around their migration status and around their speech. And so to us, it was very clear, given the sort of common critique on the consolidation of power, but also given the need to defend the right to fight back, because if we're really going to fight for a world without militarism or a world of peace, we need the space to actually go out and be free and speak our minds and gather together. So we're happy to stand with you and really glad you joined us today. But you also mentioned this idea, environmentalism without class struggle is gardening. But part of when we as trade unionists, when we think about class struggle, this is sort of inherent to us, but oftentimes we reach a limit. We're focused on what's happening in the workplace or what's happening in society around us, or in the case of the ITUC and the international institutions. But there's also a class struggle happening outside of the unions. Most of the world is unorganized workers, and there are a lot of different movements and organizations where those workers take action. One of them I'm going to move to is Oxfam, to Ed, because Oxfam has been campaigning for years to end inequality. But a lot of the feedback we get when we talk about peace, or we talk about the need to end militarism, especially now when it's very popular among our governments to all invest in it, is to say, well, what room is there really to talk about, and finance poverty reduction or to reduce inequality when national budgets are increasingly structured to support militarization? We have to do it to keep us safe. So Ed, I wanted to pose that question to you and give you the floor, in this sort of, I think, false dichotomy that they've created. We either have to invest in our safety or we have to invest in poverty reduction. We have to invest in inequality. And the choice seems to be clear for governments, but we're quite confident as trade unionists from our own members that they feel differently. So what room is there? Let's answer the question. What room is there to finance these things in a time of rising militarism? Ed, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And thanks, ITUC, for convening this, and really great to hear from you, Sean and Susie. I'm looking forward to hearing from Agnes and Agnes and Danielle also. It is clear that we're living in a time of profound contradiction. On the one hand, you've got inequality, poverty deepening across the globe. And then on the other hand, you have national budgets increasingly structured to support militarization. I think the figure in the statement is astonishing, that global military spending has reached a record $2.7 trillion. That is just incredible. And I think we can throw these stats around, but we can see how great that weight of expenditure is, while we see investments in health, education, social protection being slashed in most countries around the world. This isn't a budgetary issue. I think it's a reflection of whose lives are valued and whose are not. The wealth of the billionaire oligarchy rose 3 times faster in 2024 than in 2023. And Oxfam is now expecting 5 trillionaires to be created within a decade. All of this is while crises of the economy, climate, and conflict all mean the number of people living in poverty has barely changed since 1990. The growing concentration of wealth translates into a huge concentration of power in the hands of billionaires to shape economic decision-making in their favor. And this undermines democratic engagement and intensifies inequality further. As you say, Todd, inequality grounded in feminist and decolonial approaches. And we've seen how militarization not only diverts resources, but it entrenches injustice. Take Yemen. Oxfam's recent work there showed how militarized conflict, fueled by arms sales and geopolitical interests, has devastated lives. Over 18 million people in Yemen now need humanitarian assistance. Nearly half of the children under 5 there suffer from chronic malnutrition. And unfortunately, this is not an isolated case. It's a pattern we see in conflict zones around the world, including in Gaza, of course, including South Sudan, and many other places where militarization displaces essential services and deepens inequality. But I think the link between militarization and inequality isn't just about war. It's about how governments choose to spend all over the world. Oxfam's 2024 commitment to reducing inequality index found that 4 in 5 countries have cut spending on education, health, or social protection, and 9 in 10 have regressed on labor rights. These are political choices. They're choices that prioritize weapons over welfare. And we need to be clear, inequality itself is a driver of insecurity as well. When people are excluded from opportunity, when they're denied dignity, it breeds instability. True security really does not come from tanks or drones. It comes from justice, dignity, equality, and hope. Oxfam and our allies, some of whom I see on the call today, call out the colonial, patriarchal, and racist systems that underpin today's economic and political structures. Feminist economic models recognize care as a human right and a public good that's worth investing in. Decolonial thinking asks, who benefits from militarization? Whose bodies are sacrificed and whose voices are silenced? We need to remember overwhelming military power enabled colonialism. In India, during the period of East India Company rule, military expenditure accounted for nearly 75% of expenses, and public works constituted only about 3%. And authorities didn't repair irrigation systems, impairing agricultural productivity and intensifying famines and droughts. The use of overwhelming force has continued all the way from the colonial times into the modern day in neocolonialism. It's estimated the US tried to change other countries' governments 72 times during the Cold War. They backed the US-backed coups in places like Guatemala, Chile. They repressed national autonomy, and they supported authoritarian regimes in the guise of stopping the spread of communism. And I think we can see these agendas being echoed today. Power is the central issue here. Militarization is not about defense. It's also about control. It's about maintaining systems of extraction and domination. And feminist and decolonial movements remind us the struggle against militarization is also a struggle for liberation, for bodily autonomy, for land, for voice, for dignity, and for life itself. So what do we do? As you're asking, Todd, it's really clear there is room to finance poverty reduction and reduce inequality if decision makers make different choices to redistribute power and transform systems. The joint statement clearly outlines how to do this, but I want to surface 4 priorities from our perspective. I think firstly, taxing the rich to end extreme wealth. Global tax policy needs to fall under a UN tax convention and facilitate the payment of higher taxes by the richest and corporations to radically reduce inequality, end extreme wealth, and break this billionaire oligarchy. Secondly, we need to cancel debt that traps countries in austerity. Countries in the global north should support the cancellation of all debt and play a constructive and fully committed role in dismantling the north's dominance of the global economy in all its forms. Thirdly, of course, countries should reduce military spending. They should stop arms sales to countries who use them to violate international law or human rights law, which we are not seeing happening right now. They should eliminate nuclear weapons, as I can call for, obviously, and we all call for, and undertake full nuclear disarmament. And by freeing up that money, we should redirect this resources from weapons and war and towards building systems of solidarity and care, tackling the climate crisis, building green energy, ending poverty and hunger, and investing in gender, social, and economic equality. And I think going back to what Susie was saying finally, I think all countries must absolutely support, all countries and all of us must absolutely support anti-racist movements of indigenous peoples and oppressed social groups and coalitions of feminists, LGBTQIA+ activists and human rights organizations that challenge imperialism, anti-rights actions, and colonial legacies. We must reclaim this narrative. Militarization does not equal safety. Real safety comes from justice, equality, dignity, and solidarity. And governments must prioritize people over weapons. I think the joint statement today is a really powerful call for an alternative, and I hope it's a great stepping stone for the way forward. And just to be clear, inequality is a choice, militarization is a choice, but so is justice, so is peace, so is dignity, and so is hope. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ed. Yeah, I think the case that you illustrated for us on Yemen and how much the expenditure and the shift to conflict has cost people in real human terms is really important. And I think I want to turn to Agnes now, but Agnes, Ed says, yes, there is room to finance these priorities if we have the political will, if our leaders actually make it a priority, if we make them make it a priority. And Susie had told us earlier about the common struggles of our movements and the environmental movement, especially against authoritarian repression. But 350.org has been leading the fight for clean energy globally for a long time, but we've also seen over the past few months, acutely in the past couple of years, that as geopolitical conflict escalates, as we see war break out in more severe forms in each continent, we see corporations, we see governments putting climate concerns on the back burner. So where does, from 350's perspective, where does the climate movement fit in this increasingly crowded conversation that is on these issues of war and peace and oligarchy and autocracy and democracy? Where is there room for the climate discussion?
Thank you. And thank you to the ITUC for having me here today to represent 350, and solidarity to all the co-signatories and supporters of the letter that they've coordinated. As we approach the 80-year mark since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's actually impossible to separate the past from the present, because nuclear threat persists, militarism still dominates global politics, and the need for peace and justice is as urgent as ever. Today, we find ourselves at a crossroad with the accelerating climate crisis, the rise of militarism, and the capture of democracy by billionaires and elites, all reinforcing each other in dangerous and systemic ways. So instead of investment in our collective futures, we see global defense budgets ballooning and public money being poured into fossil fuel subsidies, and democratic space shrinking, as Susie was mentioning. And that makes it ever harder for our movements to do that important campaigning work and to push forward the agenda on climate. So it's within the context of all that the climate justice movement is critical. So while governments change, the climate justice movement is the constant, the consistent, and determined. And our challenge is to keep building that people power in the face of everything that's going on around the world. And that's why our partnership actually with the ITUC and with Greenpeace and others, and Oxfam on this call, and I'm sure many people on the webinar today, are so important. And really thank you for coordinating this letter around such a key historical event. At 350.org, we work with communities around the world who are fighting for climate justice in the face of this shrinking civic space and in the face of intensifying climate impacts, whether that's droughts in East Africa or floods in South Asia or fires in Brazil. And essentially, not only is that those climate impacts are escalating and it's affecting that work, but it's also adding to the destabilization of regions. Food systems are breaking down, conflicts are escalating over land and water. And so really, climate is a threat multiplier. Fossil fuels don't just fuel global heating, they fuel inequality, repression, and instability, which is creating a sort of vicious cycle. Climate inaction breeds crises, and then crisis is used as a justification to slow or delay action on climate and put greater investment into militarization. And I think it was Ed maybe noting earlier that militaries are among the largest carbon emitters in the world. And last year, 61 conflicts were recorded in 36 countries, which is the highest number in the last 70 years. And these wars and these conflicts are diverting resources and political attention away from the climate solutions that we so desperately need. And where fossil fuels are involved, they make it worse, and they're a driver of those conflicts. Look at how Russia used natural gas as a weapon during their invasion of Ukraine. We saw costs spiking, we saw energy supplies cut off, and essentially energy systems were used as leverage over Europe. It's the case around the world. If you look at the Amazon, fossil fuel extraction is accelerating land grabs and violence against indigenous peoples and indigenous defenders. And that's why the climate justice again fits so squarely and necessarily into today's broader fight for peace, democracy, and justice. The solutions we're fighting for are known and they're clear. Distributed renewable energy systems make communities and countries more resilient. They reduce dependency on fossil fuel giants and petrostates. and they give people democratic control over their energy futures, which is why we need a just transition onto renewables, one that delivers millions of good unionized jobs in clean energy and green industries, and one that protects communities as we shift off fossil fuels and ensures that no one is left behind. In short, the focus on energy systems is not just about emissions, it's about freedom, dignity, and peace. And climate justice and peace both demand that global cooperation that folks have been talking about on this call already, not a zero-sum militarism driven by corporate greed. And so the climate justice movement is critical, as I said, in this context, and that kind of consistency, that constancy, that determination, and that need to sort of join hands with partners across movements, that is just becoming ever more important. And as I say, that's why I really welcome being on this call today as well, with so many partners that that we value so highly. And as we move into COP30 in Belém, you know, that focus on community power and on movement power is really critical, so that we can, you know, stop the corporate greenwashing. We can displace the fossil fuel lobbyists in terms of strength and power, and we can build the strength of community leadership and Indigenous peoples and others on the front lines of climate and conflict and inequality. Because as we know, only bold systemic action can really break the cycle. And just to flag, that's also why we're planning a whole global wave of actions this September to demand a brighter future. So as world leaders are gathering at the UNGA in New York, a coalition of movements around the world will be demonstrating as a united front to draw the line on injustice and inaction. We're drawing the line against polluters, billionaires, and repression, and we invite you to join us. And we're co-creating our future, one with clean energy for all that protects people and planet, and one in which those fueling the crisis will face accountability, not as a siloed voice, but as a force that builds bridges between movements, and we connect the dots. Because the systems that drive war, inequality, and environmental collapse are the same, and they're deeply interconnected, as I said at the beginning. And so are the solutions. The fight for peace and for climate justice is one and the same. So let's win it together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnes. I was reminded when you were talking about the need for accountability, that the International Court of Justice, which we mentioned at the beginning of the call, which is hearing a case on the right to strike now, also recently had a decision on the advisory that released an advisory rather on the obligations of states in respect to climate change, and that in fact countries are legally obligated to curb emissions and protect the climate for a host of reasons that you've named. For the global wave of actions, if you could, in the chat, if there's a link that people can go to learn more, please, by all means, put it in the chat. And next, and the last of our panelists that I want to turn to for this question is Daniel at ICANN. The statement that we've all signed on to today as movement organizations points to the anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And ICANN has been at the forefront of a long fight to abolish nuclear weapons. And last year, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, the survivors of those bombings were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2024. But in a week, it's 80 years since this happened. Why is this anniversary different than the rest? What can we do to use this sort of renewed attention on nuclearization that has unfortunately come as a result of wild and reckless nuclear threats? What can we do to use this new attention to win something real in the nuclear prohibition movement?
Thanks, Todd. And first of all, thanks for having ICANN here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here among these other organizations and speaking about this global call to action, which is extremely important and timely. When we talk about Nihon Hidankyo, which is the largest largest organization representing Hibakusha, which is the Japanese word for survivors of nuclear bombing. The recent Nobel Peace Prize, it was it wasn't merely recognition. It was an acknowledgement that, as I think Sean, or I think you mentioned at the beginning, Todd, that time is running out to hear these voices and to act on their message. So the Hibakusha now, they have an average age of 86. They were, of course, children when they experienced the atomic destruction of their cities. Some of them have searing images burned into their memories about what they saw. All of them have accounts of relatives brutally killed in the immediate aftermath or from the effects of ionizing radiation. And retelling their experiences over and over again also means reliving these painful memories, and many have been doing so for decades. So we really see the Hibakusha, Nihon Nidankyo as really the inspirational leaders and the indispensable leaders of the nuclear disarmament movement. Their advocacy helped to create what's known and what many of you might have heard spoken about in the media in the last few years as the nuclear weapons taboo, which surely has contributed to nuclear weapons not having been used in conflict since 1945. We do need to also remember that this is also the 80th anniversary of the first nuclear weapons detonation, the first nuclear weapons test, which was followed by an era of more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests, each wreaking immense human suffering especially on indigenous or already marginalized communities, as well as environmental devastation that continues to this day. What makes this anniversary particularly significant is also what seems to be happening right now, which is a concerted attack on this taboo, or at least a shocking recklessness from many governments in terms of militarism generally, but also nuclear weapons. We're in the midst of a new nuclear arms race, and it's been really great to hear that some of the figures that have been thrown out, and I'll mention a few more as they relate to nuclear weapons. In 2024 alone, the 9 nuclear armed states spent $100 billion on their nuclear arsenals, and that's an 11% increase from the previous year. That's $190,151 wasted every single minute. And over the last 5 years, the global spending on nuclear weapons has increased by 47%, from 68 billion to $100 billion. And I'm here in Geneva, and the humanitarian and broader multilateral community here is speaking a lot and concerned a lot about the cuts that the United Nations is experiencing. And that figure, 100 billion, could fund the UN budget 28 times over. 1/2 of nuclear weapon spending costs as much as providing more than 7,000 meals for those facing famine. In the United States alone is spending 56.8 billion, which is more than all the others combined. This anniversary is also different because of the increase in the dangerous rhetoric we're hearing. Many of you will have seen the news. What began as French President Macron's suggestion, speculation about extending France's nuclear umbrella, has now escalated into open discussions across Europe, essentially about nuclear proliferation. Political leaders are entertaining the further stationing of nuclear weapons on their soil in direct defiance of their commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And these leaders, they seem to forget or ignore or not disclose a crucial fact, which is the nuclear weapons in Europe are meant to be used in Europe. So they're contemplating turning their own countries into nuclear targets, putting millions of civilians at risk. None of the states that currently host nuclear weapons, so Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, and Turkey, none of them ever consulted or even informed the public officially of the presence of these weapons. None of the others that subscribe to the so-called nuclear umbrella ever consulted their public on that decision. So it's really it's an affront to democracy that citizens and lawmakers in countries that boast of their democratic credentials are not allowed to know that nuclear weapons from other countries are based on their soil, or how much of their taxes is being spent on them, or under what circumstances their militaries will be involved in the use of a weapon, which would certainly entail breaking international law and certainly entail committing war crimes. The rush towards proliferation is largely driven by those who profit from it. The companies that earned at least $42.5 billion from nuclear weapons contracts in 2024 alone. These companies are part of a system which promotes the myth of nuclear deterrence, as Sean spoke about, to keep us focused on abstract theories rather than the reality. These are weapons explicitly designed to cause massive harm and intergenerational damage. Those same companies invested $128 million in lobbying efforts in the United States and France, and those are the only two countries that it's possible to find data for. 128 million working to maintain the policies that keep the money flowing to them. Nuclear deterrence, and I do want to dwell on that a little bit. It's an unprovable theory that makes naive assumptions about how humans behave and is based on the readiness and the threat to use nuclear weapons. It doesn't prevent nuclear conflict. Sean also made this point before. It makes it more likely because it encourages escalation in both nuclear rhetoric and modernization. The sanitized discourse around nuclear weapons, you never hear governments talk about their nuclear weapons. In the UK, you only hear about the nuclear deterrent as if it's some, magic shield. The sanitized discourse seems to make people forget about the real life impact that nuclear weapons have had and continue to have. So in order to achieve disarmament, we really have to dismantle the myth of nuclear disarmament and expose the ones who are promoting it. And that's, of course, what the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, and the global movement around it has the potential to achieve. Because despite these threats and the massive spending, there is momentum building in the opposite direction. There is sign of hope. Half of all states have now signed, ratified, or directly acceded to the TPNW. This treaty came in force in 2021. It represents the will of the majority and a clear rejection of the logic that keeps us all hostage to the threat of nuclear annihilation. With two major wars involving nuclear-armed states in Ukraine and Gaza, as well as escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the risk of nuclear weapons use is widely regarded as the highest or higher since the Cold War. So coming back to the Hibakusha, what they have shown us, they've shown us what nuclear weapons actually do to people through their painful testimonies shared over and over again, so the world might learn. They were instrumental in bringing about the TPNW, and now as their voices grow fewer and their time grows shorter, we must ensure that their decades of campaigning are honored and vindicated. And unfortunately, what we saw from world leaders in response to the Nobel Peace Prize, we heard a lot of lip service to their suffering and lifelong advocacy, but very few leaders were willing to actually, listen and acknowledge what the Nihon Hidankyo actually calls for. And that's what really clear. It's recognize the unacceptable humanitarian harm nuclear weapons cause, reject nuclear deterrence, and join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So we owe the Hibakusha a debt of gratitude, yeah, but we also owe them action. And I think that's why we're so excited to join this global call to action and excited to join the other organizations here in promoting it. So thank you very much, Todd.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I think what you've said at the end there, that we hear part of what we expect. Luke, our General Secretary who opened the call, will be in Japan for the commemorations next week, and we expect to hear a lot of governments say similar things, reflections, attributions, debts of gratitude, etc. But that's why for this statement, we timed it when we did, and we pointed ahead to the several opportunities they have at global meetings to take action on some of this agenda. And if you haven't read the Nobel speech given last year, I would encourage everyone to do that, because it is it's not a sanitized speech about something that happened a long time ago and just the pain of it. It's really a speech about what's happening today and what can be done and what must be done. We're right on time, and I think we could keep this conversation going all day. But I think in the interests of good democratic practice, we should move to some comments and questions from the audience. And a reminder to everyone in the audience, you can put your question in the chat or you can put it in the Q&A and we'll turn to it. But before I turn to those new questions or comments that people may have, I want to bring up to speak Rengo Japan, which is the Japanese Trade Union Confederation, and Toshihide Sugiyama to make some comments, because it would be kind of crazy to sit here and talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the threat without having our Japanese sisters and brothers take the floor themselves. So Toshihide-san, the floor is yours.
はい、皆さん、こんにちは。連合の杉山と申します。本日は発言の機会をいただきましてありがとうございます。 平和なくして、労働運動なし、これは実は私たち連合が結成以来、掲げてきた、揺るぎない信念でございます。この信念のもと、私たち連合は毎年被爆地である広島、長崎をはじめ、沖縄や北海道でも平和行動を展開し、恒久平和の実現や核兵器廃絶を世界に強く訴えてきているところでございます。広島と長崎の被爆者の皆さんご高齢となり、その貴重な証言を直接伺える時間は残念ながら限られております。まさにこれが私たちが直面している喫緊の課題となっております。ノーモア広島、ノーモア長崎、そしてノーモア被爆者、この悲痛な願いを私たちは決して風化させてはなりません。その記憶と教訓を次の世代へ、そして未来へと確実に継承していくこと、このことこそが今を生きる私たちの最大の責務だと考えております。そのために連合は具体的な取り組みを進めております。そして今日皆さん方にお願いしたいことが2つあります。まず1つ目は、見て、感じて、思いと力をぜひお寄せください。来たる8月、私たちは広島と長崎で平和集会を開催いたします。本年は ITUC のリュック・トリアングル書記長をはじめ、海外の労働組合のリーダーの皆様方にも対面で参加いただく予定となっております。そして、この集会の模様については、英語同時通訳の YouTube でもライブ配信をいたします。広島集会については、8月5日火曜日、日本時間の16時から、長崎集会については、8月8日水曜日15時30分からライブ配信をいたします。URL については、チャットをぜひご覧ください。被爆の実相を学び、平和の尊さ、皆さんと共に再確認をしたいと思います。2つ目は、行動を共にしていただきたいと思います。私たちは核兵器廃絶を求める世界の声を結集するために、核兵器廃絶1000万署名を展開しているところでございます。この署名は来月8月1日からオンラインで署名が可能となります。皆さんからいただいた声は、来年2026年の NPT 再検討会議で前に国連と日本政府に届ける予定でございます。ぜひご家族やご友人の皆様にも呼びかけ、この行動の輪にぜひ加わっていただきたいと思います。URL についてはチャットをご覧ください。昨年、核兵器被爆者の団体である日本被団協がノーベル平和賞を受賞したように、核兵器廃絶を願う世界の機運は非常に今、かつてないほど高まっていると思います。この機運をさらに大きなうねりに変えていくためにも、未来の世代が安心して暮らせる平和な世界、これを皆さんと共に力を合わせて築いていきたいと思っております。今日はご清聴いただきましてありがとうございました。よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much, Sugiyama-san. You'll see, as Sugiyama mentioned in the chat, you'll see the links to join the rallies online that are happening on the 5th and the 8th of August. You'll also see the link for the petition. If you click it now, it'll say it's still under preparation because it goes live on August 1st, which is this Friday. So 10 million signatures before the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference in 2026 is the goal. So we would greatly appreciate you supporting our sisters and brothers in Japan in this effort. And thank you again to Rengo. So now we'll turn to the rest of you for comments, for questions for our panel. You can ask these about any of the panelists directly, to all of the panelists as a whole. So one we got early on, I'll turn to from Rona Topaz. And I would ask you to speak slowly in response because Rona is using a device that transcribes what you're saying. So Rona writes that the biggest war is the class war because it's the most profitable. And as the world gets sucked into this vacuum of fascism, how can we ensure that future generations are not corrupted and doomed to repeat these past patterns? This is a heavy question. But I'd be curious if anybody wants to jump into this. For us at I2C, we think about this constantly, and we hear this from our youth committee, which is a global youth committee. Some of the struggles they face in trying to organize other young workers into trade unions, the pervasiveness of like influencer culture and the idea that people can get rich quick, the appeal of strong men. We've seen in polls around the world that while it's far from a majority, the majority are still thankfully fighting for democracy on all fronts. We do see an uptick in the number of people, young people, who say something like, maybe we need a military dictator to just fix everything overnight. How do we, as diverse movements that all recognize the class nature of some of the struggle, how do we ensure that that future generations don't get pulled into this? Anybody want to take that up? I see Daniel and then Agnes.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks, Rona, for the question. I can speak for the nuclear weapons issue, and that's the reason why this anniversary, this 80th anniversary, is so important, is that it allows us to focus on the people who have suffered the most from nuclear weapons. And they are the most, really the most effective advocates that we have for this subject. What we've tried to do in order to ensure that their message isn't lost is to provide forums for interaction, in-person interaction between them and young people, and also obviously utilize social media, unsurprisingly, to allow that interaction. After the G7 summit a couple of years ago in Hiroshima, there was one of my colleagues held a live session on TikTok with Keiko Ogura, Hibakusha, and the response was enormous. There were people who were saying they were under 20 years old, who were extremely moved and motivated by hearing Keiko Ogura. I think that live session now has about 1 million views, and the responses, the comments show that people were not previously, aware of that kind of suffering. So that's what we're doing to ensure that the past lessons are maintained and passed on to future generations. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Daniel. Agnes, I saw your hand shoot up for a second.
Well, yeah, because I think this really, this question, thank you for the question. I think it really speaks to the role of movements and the importance of movement building and building sort of intergenerational and intersectional movements that make sure that we're not thinking about, our issues and silos, but much more how can we create that sort of bedrock of strength and solidarity that, is hopefully unshakable. And I think that is obviously really important in the context of repressive laws and shrinking civic space. But I also think it's really important in the face of rising disinformation as well. So when we're sort of getting huge investment in disinformation from, the players that you'd expect. So around COP, for example, we'll expect huge spikes in disinformation around climate, and that will be coming from the sort of fossil fuel lobbyists and the fossil fuel side of things. And so I think ensuring that we're not sort of pulled apart and, pulled into these sort of culture war silos, that movement building piece and that solidarity building piece becomes indispensable. I think it becomes absolutely critical. And it's sort of the need to reclaim our democracy. So really pushing for policies that redistribute wealth and, as I say, sort of taxing billionaires and having a strong wealth tax that can ensure that money is properly distributed and going into things like social justice and climate justice work is really important. And having that democratic space that we're defending to ensure that we can push for justice is, again, really, really important. So that movement building piece, I think, creating that space and that sense of also community care between us to ensure our resilience and our ability to keep going in the face of all of this difficulty is important. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnes. And Susie, and then Ed, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really great question. And I wanted to share something that I find optimism giving, perhaps, which is that if you think about the values and you look at polling across multiple countries, the US, UK, South Africa, Brazil, and you see the kind of values that across generations people still have. So, for example, an honest and respectable life, or in similar vein to how the statement is worded today, safety and security. These things are still universal. They are still cross-cutting and cross-generations. And the question for us, I think, as organizations and as movements, is how do we use that set of values and how do we contest the values that we need to contest with the right? So at the moment, the right, for example, has really captured the security frame. Whether that's on immigration, whether that's on militarization, they have captured the security frame. And at the same time, we know that security means, having a bed, having a roof over your head, having decent work, having a vision into the future that your children will still be able to live in a sustainable climate. And so I think we need to ask ourselves as movements, and I think we can have more of this discussion. How do we engage in the conversation across generations, across countries on a value level? And not just on an issue level, not on a policy level. Those things are important. It's good to have demands. It's good to know what to say when you're in diplomatic conversations or at COP. But when we're speaking to ordinary people, I mean, our family members, our friends, the people we live surrounded by, the way that we usually communicate as humans is led by values. And I think that something that gives me optimism is that values seem to hold across generations, even as you can poll people and they say things like, I would like a dictator to solve all my problems, Todd. Even as they say that, they still have a strong set of values around security, dignity, family, tradition. These things are contestable. It's not possible for us to contest them all with the right. We have to be selective and we have to know which ones we've lost. But there are many that we haven't lost. And this is why, for us, it was such an important thing to come to this today and to sign this statement, is because we really believe that trying to regain ground on values like security, from the meta level, from the policy level, all the way to the personal level, is one of the ways that we avoid a further descent into fascism. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Ed.
Yeah, and just building exactly on what Agnes and Susie are saying, I think if you talk to people in more or less any country, they feel that their country should be more equal, but they don't see a way to make it so. So people feel kind of helpless in the face of inequality, and we know that increased inequality is the key thing that will rise for everyone in each society. But I think what's kind of missing is that international solidarity and connection. I think it's really great what you're saying, Susie, about connecting on those values, and Agnes about connecting across boundaries. That's across thematic boundaries and across borders. I think this is the crucial thing that needs to happen more. And I think looking at the participation on this call, obviously the groups that signed up to the statement overall, but also everybody else who's excited to come and join this call to talk about these issues, I think the more we can spread knowledge and solidarity across those borders, the more people can then engage on that values basis that Susie's talking about and really kind of understand the differences. I think you see in countries that are more equal, there's not really much understanding of places that are unequal, because people do not have the opportunity to engage or travel or see the different places where people are living, and the connection on a values basis, and then the difference in terms of policy and delivery and oligarchy and what have you. So I think there's something to be said for making those solidarity connections across boundaries, which I know is the core of the trade union movement. Obviously, it's the core of a lot of the NGOs who are on the call and a lot of the different movements who are on the call today. So I think the more that we can make those connections across borders and across boundaries, the better.
Thanks so much, Ed. Sean, and then I'd like to move on to the other question.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. First, just to say I agree, of course, with everything the previous panelists have mentioned here. Maybe to start, I would say at this current moment, I think there is absolutely an awakening of many people to the interconnectedness of our struggles and to the precariousness of this moment, and the identification that we need to find a different way. We need to find a new way. Maybe they don't know the way yet. Maybe they are just in one path or another. But I do think there's energy there now. Typically, in these moments of extreme uncertainty, insecurity, there is an awakening of civil society. The problem is that when the situation gets better, and I'm sure we're all here in agreement, we hope things will get better and that's, we will be listened to. But in those moments, then, the post-Cold War, for example, there is a shift, there is a reduction of the energy. So I think one other thing I'd mention is just the need for sustained efforts, that none of the issues we're facing will be done at a certain time without consistent pressure, without continued pressure that goes on continually. Otherwise, there's very high likelihood that we will slide back into inequalities and difficult times, wars, etc. So these efforts need to be sustained even at moments of perceived peace, of perceived justice. There's always more to be done, and there's always the vigilance of maintaining it as well. And the other point that I would mention is just the importance of meeting people where they're at, of understanding, how these issues that are happening on a global scale affect someone in a small town, small village, wherever they may be at, and showing the connections to their daily life. Most people are concerned with their human security, fundamentally, with their own sense of well-being, their family, their loved ones, those around them. And it is quite clear when we talk about it in these forums, what happens to them on their personal level is related to what we're seeing on the global stage and all of the levels in between. So I think it's also important that we're able to communicate properly of what is happening in someone's life and how it connects with all of the issues we're discussing here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. We have a few more questions. I'm hoping we have time for all of them, so I'm going to direct a couple of them as we go. One in the Q&A feature is from Oscar at the Olof Palme Center. He's wondering if we can say something about the consequences of the huge cuts in financial aid and international development aid specifically that have happened around the world, which obviously we all know from watching the news that these things happen, but I don't think people necessarily fully understand the consequence, especially as it relates to conflict, what this means when you suddenly do not deliver the food, the healthcare, and the other aid that people rely on, and how we as movements can respond to that, or how we are responding to that. Would anybody like to, well, I'll have two panelists maybe. Would anybody like to respond to that question on cuts to financial aid and cuts to international development aid? Yeah, Ed.
Yeah, Oscar, I think this is a really fundamental question about priorities at the end of the day. This is where we get to the heart of the challenges of this militarization obsession. I think one of the starkest contrasts was the gathering to replenish Gavi, the vaccine mechanism, the mechanism for delivering vaccines around the world, happened on the same day as the recent NATO summit in the same place. So they held the Gavi replenishment round in the evening in Brussels so that people who were attending, leaders who were attending the NATO summit, could hot-foot it from NATO, where they pledged a huge upscale of military spending, and then go and replenish the Gavi fund, which would then allow vaccines to be more widely available for all. And of course, Gavi fell short of its request. They asked for 11.9 billion, and they fell nearly 3 billion short of the request that they needed. And then, meanwhile, up at the NATO summit, we just saw a huge commitment to increase military spending. So, as we've said in the statement, the total spending in military is growing to $2.7 trillion. If you compare that to the Gavi replenishment, it's small fry, it's easy. If you compare it to the total spending on aid, that's just 179 billion. So the aid spending the differences between aid spending and military spending is just incredible, and the impacts are real, as you'll be fully aware. But the impacts are huge. We see the blockade on Gaza right now. We see children starving in Gaza right now due to a militarized approach, and due to a lack of aid being allowed to get in because of the blockade, but also overall, as the example that I used in Yemen earlier, you see just a depletion of aid across the world, and you see children, you see adults dying because of that. And this is fundamentally, as I said earlier, I think this is about priorities. It's about whose lives you value, whose lives matter, and that's what we really need to change.
Yeah, and I think for the labor movement to sort of take the moderator's privilege here for Oscar's question, a lot of the trade union movement, especially in parts of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, relied on development aid to help build unions as democratic institutions, critical pillars to democratic life. But and now that's gone, and that has meant for a lot of unions their ability to sort of, from things like building membership databases to running campaigns or organizing, those resources are gone. But I think to Susie's point that we're surrounded by as many opportunities as we are threats. For the trade union movement, the answer is quite clear, which is it's organizing, and that can be a throwaway line. But the reality is quite clear, which is both our political independence and our strength as democratic member-based organizations, as working class organizations of struggle, is how many workers are actually engaged in the daily life of the union, and to sort of transition back to the roots, which is not as insurance companies with clients that pay a subscription and get services in response, but as organizations where workers can come together across borders, across religious lines, across all of these other categories that are used to separate us, and make a common plan together, build a common strategy together, win together. And it has to start with a massive reinvestment and reallocation of money to organizing workers to actually do this. And that's, for our movement, the big struggle, which is why the ITUC just in June launched a new organizing partnership with Organizing for Power to sort of make the fundamentals of organizing available all over. That was a direct response to calls from affiliates who said, we have to get back to organizing. We can't rely on this aid anymore. The governments are not reliable. They're not reliable anymore. And if we're going to finance our movement, we have to organize people, and those people have to have a real ownership in the union. Why else would you pay a fee? You pay because you believe in what the organization's doing, not merely because it's another service. And so that return to organizing methodology, which exists all over the world and in multiple movements, but is the core work of the trade union movement, I think is really key. Sean, I'm going to hold just for the sake of another question, if that's okay. I want to bring Naz Al-Azimi, who's been waiting patiently. Naz, I'm going to promote you to talk so you can have a minute to ask your questions, so we have time for the panelists to respond. You are able to speak now if you take yourself off mute, Naz.
Yes, hello, you hear me?
Yes.
محمد العرادة، مستشار الاتحاد العام لعمال الكويت ورئيس مكتب العمالة المهاجرة. بداية، الاحتلال والهيمنة من القوى الكبرى هي السبب الرئيسي للعنف، وأيضا تدخل القوى الإقليمية والدولية دائما يطيل أمد النزاع، وأيضا مصالح القوى العظمى غالبا ما تعرقل حلول السلام، وأيضا غياب العدالة الاجتماعية والاقتصادية يخلق إحباطا شعبيا يتحول إلى عنف، وكذلك ضعف الدولة ومؤسسات العدالة الاجتماعية يؤدي إلى انعدام الأمن ويفرض الفوضى، وأيضا الازدواجية معايير العمل الدولية تشجع على الاستبداد والعنف. وآخر نقطة أؤكد عليها أن غياب المحاسبة الدولية يعزز من الإفلات من العقوبة، وأن السلام لا يأتي عبر القتل أو الدبابة أو المجاعة، إنما السلام يأتي عبر العدالة والمساواة. وشكرا لكم.
Thank you so much, Nassar. We had a little bit of trouble hearing the interpreter, but I think I got most of it about the lack of social justice, the absence of international accountability in institutions, and at the end, of course, that peace does not come through tanks and famine, forced famine. It comes through us actually using these institutions effectively. And I think this gets a little bit to what Oscar was asking about too, was like sort of the state of international aid and the state of international financing. And I think it was Daniel who said earlier, I may have the number wrong, but just the nuclear expenditures budget could fund the UN budget 20 some times over, I think. So thank you very much, Naz, for that comment. I have another in the Q&A here from Hania Bitar from Palestine. How can civil society around the world be more offensive than defensive when it comes to protecting the world and reinforcing the values we believe in? If we patiently wait for things to evolve, we're at risk of putting off the last glimpse of hope that people have. And I want to combine that with a question that was in the chat from Shanaz in India, who said, fighting for democracy, dignity, justice, equality is deeply challenging for workers across South Asia because of authoritarian governance, economic precarity, social exclusion, shrinking civic space. So what strategies can we take in this kind of environment? So you see on the one hand, how can we be more on the offensive than the defensive? And in cases where we're already under authoritarian pressure, we're already increasingly in very dangerous environments, what kind of strategies can we actually deploy? This is a question we get a lot at the ITUC. Does anybody want to respond to this? How can civil society go on the offensive? And how can we operate even in spaces where we're already feeling the constraints of authoritarianism? Yeah, Agnes.
These are such excellent questions. And just to say, I don't think there's any silver bullet answer. I don't think there's one. And here's the amazing answer that I have to solve all your problems with that. But I do think, is it Hania, is absolutely right. And I think civil society can't afford to be sort of in a passive or reactive role, especially not now. And at 350.org, we believe that climate justice is absolutely inseparable from the broader struggles of human rights and freedom, including the fight for justice in Palestine. So I think being offensive rather than defensive means building people power that speaks to the sort of uncomfortable truths and demands accountability really clearly and holds institutions to the values that they claim to uphold. And it means linking our struggles. So whether that's in Palestine or the Amazon, people are resisting systems of violence and extraction that treat them as disposable. So I think sort of acting really boldly and visibly as, you know, if you can, is a really important answer. But of course, the question about from Shanaz sort of saying that actually it's really challenging, I think that's such a critical piece to raise, because I think, you know, those sort of laws, those repressive laws are designed to sort of shrink collective power, especially for workers and activists. So in those instances, I think cross-border solidarity becomes really, really critical. So what one movement can't say inside a country, often others can sort of say on the outside and apply that sort of external pressure in places where they're safer and freer to do so. And so making the most of those capabilities and those capacities in other countries to support that, I think, is really critical and one of the best things about a global movement or global movements joining together to take action. And I think, you know, that can be done really well to sort of spotlight repression and protect offenders in different countries. And then I think just going back to that thing of needing to connect our struggles so that it's harder to isolate individual issues or individual sort of areas of work or defence work, so that it's harder to sort of to dampen down, and it makes it easier for us to amplify as movements. And I think finally decentralized organizing becomes really important, so that, you know, I think as Susie was saying earlier, you can't just attack one. It's about all of us standing up together and saying, you attack one, you attack all of us. And I think that makes it, again, a lot less easy to sort of take us down. But that's a perspective, as I said, not the golden answer or the silver bullet answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnes. And to close us off, I have Susie and Daniel. So if you could keep your last interventions a bit brief for our interpreter's sake, so we end close to on time. Susie.
Yeah, absolutely. I think great questions. And I just want to raise something that I think we try to live by a lot in many of our movements, which is that fear and uncertainty together tend to lead to hate, and fear and action together tend to lead to courage. And I think that the first step is the best step. And we should take risks where we can for the places where we can't. And that the solidarity is crucial. Let's champion what's working. Let's champion the solutions that exist. And let's remember that no social movement was ever won without some courage in the face of what seems like unassailable odds.
Daniel?
I'll just be very quick. I mean, fully agree with what Agnes and Susie have said. I mean, I think for us, being offensive means also we have to be adaptable. And one thing that for us that inevitably leads to that we have to work more locally, which is obviously a bit of a strange thing for a lot of people when it comes to nuclear weapons, which people assume is defined at a kind of very high national level. But what we found is, politically and also in terms of motivating people, getting the wins working in local activism is extremely motivating for the broader movement, but also it can have real political impacts, especially in political parties. Local politics does have influence on national parties sometimes. So that's just one lesson that we've learned recently.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you. I want to give a round of applause, of digital applause, to all of our panelists today for joining us. So thank you to Agnes from 350.org. Thanks to Ed from Oxfam, Susie from Greenpeace, Sean from IPB, Daniel from ICANN. Thanks to our colleagues from Rengo for their intervention as well. I will quickly put in the chat some of the key links from today, both the joint statement, the Rengo petition, the climate action week that was shared by our colleagues earlier. And again, thank you all very much. In a week, we will commemorate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but every day and for the weeks and months ahead, we'll be fighting together for a more peaceful and just world. So thank you all, and we'll see you soon.